All right, welcome to our first episode of The Teacher and the Psychiatrist. This is our first series of this new side series that we're doing here. I'm Juan Pablo de Leon.
Lauro Amezcua-Patiño.
Let's get after it.
That's right.
How you doing? You doing solid today?
I'm doing okay.
Did you see all your people today?
Yeah, I work in the hospital a little bit in the morning and having to see patients, and it's pretty busy right now. I mean, with this whole COVID thing, there's a lot of stress on the streets, and people are reacting in intense ways. So we end up having to admit a lot of people to the hospital. So that's what I spend my morning today.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a super scary thing that's going on right now for sure.
Yes.
You know, being in a hospital right now, I know everyone agrees that, you know, you guys are our first line of defense against this, and being out there and helping people, you know, is super, super important. One phrase that I've heard get thrown around a lot, and I think will kind of frame our conversation, is that these are crazy times.
Yes.
Right? That term crazy is something that, you know, has a lot of different connotations attached to it. I know that a few years back, I was a camp counselor just for little kids at the YMCA. And one of the things my boss told me was, don't ever tell the kids they're being crazy, or, oh my gosh, you're so crazy, even jokingly. And I think it had to do with a particular situation that they had there. But I guess there was a parent or something like that who had some sort of, you know, mental illness, was struggling with mental illness. And at some point, someone said something playful like that, right? Like, oh, you're being crazy. And the kid freaked out because he had heard that term in such negative ways so many times before. What do you think about that term? How do you feel like that term impacts people or makes people feel about their mental health? Or,
Well, you know, the term crazy is not something that we use in my business, in psychiatry in particular, because of what you mentioned before, the connotation that somebody is abnormal, right? And the term is used so loosely that people use it in daily conversation in terms of trying to describe something that is intense, that is different, that is bizarre, right? So when you take it away from the context of describing societal stuff and you put it in the context of an individual, the individual may get very defensive, right? So you don't know, when you are in a day-to-day situation, who has dealt with mental health issues, right? So everybody's going to perceive that wording as something offensive, or something that is critical, or something that is rejecting. So you have to be prepared for people reacting to that term in a lot of different ways. And that is similar to what has happened to the word bipolar, for example, right?
yeah, it's used very loosely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So actually we wrote a paper about that a while ago in terms of people utilizing bipolar as a way of describing intense mood swings or intense changes of behavior. When in reality, bipolar in the psychiatric sense describes a very specific disorder. So when you take it out of context, you have to be prepared to have to deal with the consequences of taking it out of context, right?
So that same year that I was working at the YMCA, you know, I was very critical of this term crazy. You know, I was brand new, you know, to working in childcare. I had been coaching. I had been doing some things that were pre to teaching, you know, things like that. I had been an assistant coach and stuff, but I hadn't worked with the type of student population you would get at a YMCA, right? And there was a student who we were playing a little game, and he would always say like, I'm gonna go crazy. And this kid he was a foster child. I think that he had some issues with abuse and things like that, like parental abuse, and that's why he was in foster care. And I remember one time we were playing dodgeball, and he hit a kid or he got hit and he didn't get out. So I told him, all right, you got to sit out over here. And he got really mad. And I made a point to stay really, really calm. And I said, buddy, come on over here. Just sit for 1 minute. 1 minute and you can get back in the game. And he lost his mind. And he said, I'm going to go crazy. And he runs over to a brick wall and starts hitting his head against the brick wall as hard as he can. And I worked really, really hard to, again, stay relaxed. I didn't want to escalate the situation at all. So I go up and I go, buddy, please stop hitting your head against the wall. You're going to hurt yourself. And so at that point, I'm starting to de-escalate the situation. And my boss comes in and she was quite moody. She was pregnant at the time. And she had a lot of run-ins with this particular kid. So they didn't have the greatest of relationship. She comes in and she says, oh my God, stop doing that. You're always doing that. He starts cussing at her. He runs out the building. We have to tackle him and subdue him, bring him into the building until he relaxed and everything. And I think that sometimes this term crazy is really a descriptive term, right? Like we use it maybe the same way we'd use the term bipolar in sort of a loose sense. We would say, oh, my air conditioning's being bipolar.
Correct.
Right? And it downplays the whole situation. It makes it too casual, right? Like people are talking a lot about how there's kind of a war on language right now because words are really powerful, right? So when you use terms like this, you can really damage how serious, someone actually feels, right?
I had to mention a number of things. One, what you describe is a situation that I deal with every day, right? I mean, having to deal with the child manifesting behaviors that are dangerous, either to themselves or to other people, and really requires kind of a specialized interventions, right? I do have to say that being pregnant doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be moody, okay? Because that's a whole other issue, in terms of our perception,
Yeah.
And that can be perceived as being chauvinistic.
Yeah, sorry to our nothing against our pregnant listeners.
Exactly,
we love you. You're doing something I can't do.
Exactly. So it's important to understand that everything has to do with how much and how often, right? So because there is no good definition of normalcy, it's very difficult to identify at what point normal becomes abnormal, right? Mm-hmm. What is the line? I mean, we tend to utilize simple concept. For example, things become abnormal when they become dangerous
or violent.
Well, you can be violent and not be dangerous, right? So that's where you actually have to be able to recognize, as you said before, when do I have to intervene? And what usually happens in situations like this is that if the person who's supposed to be in control starts becoming out of control, then you have a problem.
In this case, my boss.
Exactly, because once she becomes intense in terms of her reaction to the situation, then you're having two problems. You're having a child and you're having an adult, and you have to de-escalate both, right? So it's very important that whoever is intervening is not intervening as a way of manifesting power and control, that you're manifesting understanding and empathy at the same time that you're assertive and you're setting boundaries, right? So you can direct the child toward, this is not an appropriate way of handling this, but I understand you're having a difficult time. Okay? Sometimes, and not unusually, you're going to have to intervene physically, you have to restrain someone, but you also have to be very aware of what you're dealing with. And what happens, especially in places where there's no professional intervention, is that you consider all the kids the same. And you really have to have a good way of assessing, is this kid having issues because of reactivity to have been abused in the past? Is this kid dealing with high-functioning autism? Is this kid dealing with issues of substance abuse? So all of those different things, you have to know what you're working with, because that gives you guidance in terms of how do I go about dealing with this, right? Because at the end, it's not about me gaining control of the child. It's about the child adapting in a non-aggressive way. And that's a process, right? It's not going to happen. I mean, you cannot put the kid or other children at risk in a situation like that. So in the hospital, we have specific protocols to deal with that, right? In the old days of psychiatry, we used to tie down people, use leathers and put them. We don't do that anymore. In the hospital that I work at, we don't use leathers.
So what would you do if you had a similar situation? Somebody's completely, getting physically, maybe physically hurting themselves. Would you consider that a situation where someone's being violent, but not necessarily dangerous? Definitely not dangerous to others, but dangerous to themselves in that case. I mean, this kid was whacking his head really hard against a brick wall. What would you do in a situation like that? Would it arise in the hospital setting?
There's a lot of science behind that. There's a lot of practice. There are actually specific protocols that people in my business have to be trained on. But basically the concept is you have to bring a lot of people. Okay, more than one person. You need to bring 2, 3, 4 people that are available. You have to make sure that other kids are safe. You have to intervene, and the kid needs to know that you're providing them with an environment of safety, right? But they need to immediately stop doing what they're doing, right? But that requires a lot of neutrality. That requires that you are not becoming an aggressor yourself, right? Because then you become the wall. And instead of the kid hitting the wall, it's going to start hitting you.
Well, that was the frustrating part for me, was that, I was maintaining my composure and trying to get this kid to settle down. And I saw that he was settling down. I don't know if he hit his head a couple times too hard and he was like, whoa, this is getting serious. But it was frustrating to me that, someone came and escalated a situation that I was pretty effectively de-escalating. Sometimes I find that people who don't know how to handle high pressure, tense situations, who don't have experience with that, become a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more violent in those situations. And that's how they choose to communicate, because they're not used to that high level of adrenaline or pressure on them.
Well, people who are not trained are going to react to what they know, what their experience has been, how they would handle themselves as children when they were out of control, how they handle their own children when their children get out of control. But you have to understand that when you're getting into therapeutic issues, you have to have some degree of understanding and training of what you're dealing with. I mean, you also have to be very careful that if you are being successful at doing what you're doing and somebody comes and intervenes and you become frustrated because of that, now you become part of the problem too, because you're getting distracted and you're going to start directing your frustration towards something, right? So it's very important in our work, in a day-to-day work in the hospitals, things like this. We have to have people who are leading the process. We have people who have specific roles in terms of what they're doing with this. But again, you have to stay focused on what am I trying to accomplish, not who's right or who's wrong, okay? Because you may find sometimes with a different type of child under the same circumstances, they respond to something different. So you have to be open and keep doing what you're doing. And sometimes when I've been in situations like that, I tried not to become confrontational with the second person of leadership, right? If you have led the process and the second person wants also lead, you have to do subtle things like put your head down and, and instead of getting frustrated and turning around and start arguing with that person, right? Because if the kid's connecting with you, you have to continue that process. And you can be successful. Often you're not, and you're going to have to get 1 or 2 people to hold the kid. There's some situations in which especially when you're dealing with autistic kids, they don't like to be touched.
Yeah.
So it becomes a little more problematic, because our tendency is to try to soothe. Let me put my arm around you. You can't do that, right?
Yeah.
So there's certain things that you have to be a little more careful with.
I know that building relationships is extremely important. I've been able to, in one of my previous podcasts, I talked about how I stopped a fight from happening just because I knew one of the kids and I used my presence and came in and stopped an altercation from occurring, where there's been other instances of violence on school campus before where I don't know the kids and they're not so quick to respond because they don't know me. I'm an authority figure, but I'm not their authority figure. That's got to be a huge part of de-escalating, or just in general doing an effective job as a psychiatrist, right? Is building that close relationship of trust.
Well, building a relationship takes time. And sometimes, as you said, you don't know the kid. I mean, it happens to me in the hospital every day. A kid comes in and has a history of violence, and I'm interviewing the kid starts to escalate. At that moment, if I don't know the child, I have to use whatever tools I have to not worsen the escalation or start de-escalating. And the rule number one of de-escalation is to maintain neutrality. If you starting to escalate, right, then you're going to lose that. The situation is going to be bad. It's going to get into. So you have to maintain your tone of voice. You have to maintain your calmness. And one of the things that I've learned a long time ago is don't challenge the other person with your eyes, and that's a very basic animal behavior, because even without talking, you're trying to determine who's in charge. And it becomes difficult when you are used to being in a position of authority to surrender your authority, okay, and let the other person feel that they are in control, okay. You're not losing anything. You're actually saving a situation. So
it even comes down to your physical gestures, like remain calm, like don't try and make yourself big or intimidating or anything. Just bring it down a notch. Let's all just relax, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you can see when two dogs are going to fight with each other, right? What did they do?
They lock eyes and they
exactly
make themselves big and flex up
until one of the dogs puts their head down, right?
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with putting your head down.
Put your head down. Put your head down.
That's smart.
Yeah. Well, I think we could all use a little bit of, relaxation in these tense times, these, for lack of better words, crazy times. Take a second to listen, right? To listen and to relax and not be afraid to be the one to put your head down.
No, not only that, but it's also important to start switching from crazy times to intense
times.
So always think in terms, it's not the things that are abnormal, they're very intense. So because the next step to that is, okay, we want to change intensity by dialing it down and not by eliminating it. And that's a major issue right now. We want this thing to go away. No, let's figure out all the things that we can do, to dial it down. So wash your hands, keep your distance, wear your mask, don't touch your face, the basic stuff, you know. It's important to understand that you're not crazy if you wear a mask, right? I think it's also important to remember that in the context of situation of violence, one thing that we didn't mention is if things are getting out of control and you're getting out of control, move yourself away from the situation, right?
You don't have to be there.
Well, you don't have to be there. You may make things worse, and we don't need heroes, right? I mean, cemeteries are full of heroes, so I think it's better to be smart, and to be effective.
Let's not make things any more intense than they need to be.
Correct.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much to all of our listeners. This is a great first episode.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed it.
That was really good.
Yeah.
Cool.
And there's a lot more to come, though.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much to all of our listeners. You can find the Solo Tu or the Only You podcast on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. You can also find my podcast, the Mr. Teacher Man podcast, on all of those platforms as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.